This is a quick look at the book of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet in the time of Jeroboam II in the northern kingdom of Israel. So Israel had been divided for about 200 years, and Hosea was someone who was warning them about the Assyrian invasion and warning the people about their unfaithfulness to God. And one of the things that is very striking about Hosea, particularly this this first chapter, as we begin to look at the story, is to realise that God told him to take a wife who was clearly a woman with some reputation, with a very definite inclination to run after other lovers, and a woman who must have broken his heart. And so we see something about God's heart and his compassion and his care in this book. And I was listening to a little talk a bit earlier, and the passage about where King David, at the time of probably when he's doing quite well in terms of being king and having everything sort of going well in his life, at that time he becomes complacent and foolish, really, and gets kind of tempted and ends up in an adulterous relationship, and then does all sorts of stuff to try and cover up his tracks. And of course, it all comes out in the light. And the difference between that situation and that scenario and the story of Hosea is incredibly striking. So often we might be making the mistake of that's really our own sin, our own failure, our own moral weakness leading us into temptation, and our own brokenness. And Hosea's heartache is not his own sort of foolish behaviour. It's the whole situation of opening up his heart to somebody who actually goes and breaks it. And one of the most painful things that people have to deal with, is when someone that they have put enormous trust in and confidence in breaks their heart. And obviously, particularly in a marriage, in that close relationship, emotions are deeply affected very quickly. And Hosea's story is full of that kind of pain. And so that is really a reflection about God's heart for Israel. God's heart is not a heart of condemnation, but compassion and a longing for reconciliation, a longing for healing and restoration. And I just want to read a little bit of Hosea chapter 1, and just going to start on verse 8. So each of his children have prophetic names, so names that are names with a message. And so there's they've already sort of had a situation in their family, and some of those names have had prophetic meaning and so on. And so we're just moving on now to the child that's called Lo Ami, which is all about the breaking of the covenant. And so let me just read this quickly. Okay, so after she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, Gomer, that's his wife, had another son. Then the Lord said, "Call him Lo-ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." So Lo-ami means not my people. So Lo-ruhamah was not loved, and Lo-ami is not my people. So the Lord said, "Call him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." And verse 10, "Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it is said to them, 'You are not my people,' they will be called sons of the living God." The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. And so it feels like it must be an impossibility to be talking about unity and reconciliation, and even this talk about the coming together of the land 200 years after it was, bitterly divided, and also this whole thing about God's people becoming reconnected to Him, which is even more of a miracle in many ways, of people who seem to have gone after other gods, who are facing a terrible invader that they don't seem to be in any sort of state of spiritual strength to be able to cope with what's about to come their way. And they clearly are engaging with all sorts of idolatry and so on. And so this passage is mentioned again later in the New Testament, and it's a very, very encouraging passage in the sense that we are in a situation sometimes where we are so separated from God that we don't have anything counting in our favour, and we don't seem to be in a position of being reconciled to God, and sometimes perhaps so far off the mark that it's very hard to see how we could ever be in a place of intimate relationship to God again, and yet that's very much the story of Hosea's life. That brokenness, that ripping apart the covenant relationship, that pain of adultery, that sort of betrayal of closeness and intimacy, the woundedness that has caused in their marriage, the heartache of God that he tries to explain to his people through Hosea's life, through this story, through this very deep and personal tragedy, and yet in that place, God is interested to reconcile. God is interested to heal and restore and do the impossible of bringing back a covenant relationship together with His people. And so we want to just pray today that wherever we're at, God would bring us back to a place of restoration. God would bring us back to a place of deep knowing Him, not just a kind of superficial, intellectual, assent of knowing Him, but a deep personal covenant relationship, a revisiting of that intimacy with Him, a restoring of all that's been lost, every part that's been damaged in our hearts and lives by our disconnect with God. So I pray that would be the experience that we have, and we would rediscover that relationship afresh today, and find that closeness that we may have had before, we may never have had before, but we would find that closeness with Him